A royal guard marched straight through the gates of Britain's most secure prison, dressed head to toe in full ceremonial uniform. The officers on duty ordered him to stop and turn around, but he didn't say a word. Instead, he handed over a sealed Ministry of Defense file stamped eyes only and spoke just 5 words. "He saved my life once." They scrambled to halt him, tried to radio higher-ups, but the guard had already crossed the threshold, stepping into a place where no one in uniform enters without high-level clearance. What they didn't realize was that the man he was there for had been imprisoned without trial for 7 years. And this guard wasn't there for tradition or ceremony, he was there to bring someone back. Before we reveal what was inside that classified file, be sure to subscribe and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. What happened next will leave you speechless. Dawn was breaking over London when Lance Sergeant Callum Briggs stood before the mirror in his quarters, adjusting every detail of his Queen's Guard uniform. The scarlet tunic gleamed under the fluorescent tea lights, each brass button polished to perfection. But beneath the ceremonial splendor, his heart hammered with nervous energy. Today wasn't about standing guard at Buckingham Palace or participating in royal ceremonies. Today was about keeping a promise that had haunted him for months. The journey to Belmarsh prison felt surreal. Here was a man whose daily routine involved protecting royalty, standing motionless for hours in tourist photographs, maintaining the dignity of centuries-old traditions. Yet now he was heading toward one of Britain's most notorious maximum security facilities, carrying documents that could either free an innocent man or end both their careers forever. Belmarsh rose from the morning mist like a medieval fortress, all concrete and razor wire. Inside those walls lived the dregs of society bombers who had tried to tear London apart, killers who showed no remorse, criminals who had forfeited any claim to mercy. But somewhere in that labyrinth of cells was a different kind of prisoner entirely, a soldier whose only crime had been telling the truth. The security checkpoint buzzed with tension as Briggs approached. Prison guards had seen many visitors over the years, lawyers, family members, social workers, clergy. But a Queen's Guard in full ceremonial dress was unprecedented. The lead guard, a weathered man named Thompson, studied the approaching figure with undisguised suspicion. "This is highly irregular," Thompson announced, his hand hovering near his communication device. "You're not on any visitor list I've seen." Briggs withdrew the sealed document from inside his tunic, the royal crest catching the harsh fluorescent lighting. "I believe this addresses your concerns," he replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was attempting. Thompson examined the paperwork with growing bewilderment. The legal language was archaic, the references obscure, but the seals and signatures appeared genuine. This wasn't some hastily forged document. Someone had invested serious time and expertise into its creation. The guard glanced up at Briggs, seeing something in the soldier's eyes that suggested this was far more than a routine administrative matter. The roots of this extraordinary day stretched back to the dusty mountains of Afghanistan, where war had a way of stripping men down to their essential character. 2 years earlier, Sergeant Reese Nolan had been leading reconnaissance patrols through Taliban territory, gathering intelligence on insurgent movements and trying to protect Afghan civilians, caught in an endless cycle of violence. The ambush came without warning on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other. Briggs' unit was returning from a village consultation when the world erupted in gunfire and explosions. Taliban fighters had positioned themselves perfectly, creating a deadly crossfire that pinned down the British soldiers in an exposed valley. With minimal cover, Briggs felt the eyed explosion before he heard it, a thunderous blast that lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into a rocky outcropping. Shrapnel tore through his leg, and warm blood soaked into the Afghan soil beneath him. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear his squadmates shouting, some calling for medics, others returning fire at muzzle flashes in the surrounding hills. The Taliban assault was methodical and deadly. They had studied British tactics, learned from previous engagements, positioned themselves to inflict maximum casualties while minimizing their own exposure. As Briggs drifted in and out of consciousness, he could see enemy fighters moving closer, their AK-47s spitting death as they advanced on the wounded patrol. That's when Nolan made the decision that would forever link their destinies. Instead of seeking cover like military doctrine dictated, he charged directly into the killing field. Bullets whined past his helmet as he sprinted toward Briggs' position, his own rifle firing controlled bursts at Taliban positions. 2 rounds punched through Nolan's body armor, the ceramic plates absorbing most of the impact. but still delivering crushing blows to his ribs. A third bullet caught him in the upper thigh, sending him stumbling, but not stopping his desperate charge toward his fallen comrade. "I've got you, mate," Nolan gasped as he reached Briggs, hauling the semi-conscious soldier over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. "We're both walking out of here." The journey to the evacuation point was a nightmare of pain and determination. Nolan stumbled through enemy fire, his own blood mixing with Briggs as Taliban fighters closed in from multiple directions. Every step was agony, every breath a struggle, but he refused to abandon a brother in arms. The helicopter extraction saved both their lives, but recovery proved to be a different kind of battle. Briggs spent weeks in military hospitals, undergoing multiple surgeries to repair his shattered leg. The physical therapy was brutal, but he was alive, and eventually he would return to duty. Nolan's wounds ran deeper, both physically and psychologically. During his convalescence, Nolan had too much time to think about what he had witnessed during his tours in Afghanistan. The mistakes, the miscommunications, the operations that went wrong and resulted in civilian casualties that were then covered up or rationalized away. His conscience, already troubled by the moral ambiguities of counterinsurgency warfare, began to weigh heavily on him. The breaking point came with Operation Sandstorm, a nighttime raid based on intelligence that later proved to be catastrophically flawed. The target was supposed to be a Taliban safe house, but the coordinates were wrong. The timing was off, and when British forces breached the compound, they found a family instead of insurgents. What happened next would haunt Nolan for the rest of his life. In the confusion and darkness, with adrenaline running high and nerves stretched to breaking point, soldiers fired at shapes they mistook for threats: a grandfather protecting his granddaughter, a father shielding his children, a mother trying to gather her family to safety. The official after-action report painted a very different picture. According to the sanitized version prepared by military intelligence, Operation Sandstorm had been a tactical success that eliminated several high-value Taliban targets. The dead civilians were reclassified as combatants, their ages altered, weapons supposedly found in their possession. Nolan was called to a meeting in a sterile conference room on the base, where 3 officers sat behind a polished table like judges at a tribunal. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, a career politician in uniform, led the discussion with practiced bureaucratic efficiency. "Sergeant Nolan, we need you to review and sign this corrected version of your initial report," Harrison said, sliding the falsified document across the table. "There were some errors in your original assessment that need to be addressed." Reading the revised report felt like a physical blow to Nolan's stomach. Every detail had been changed, every witness statement altered, every inconvenient fact eliminated or transformed. The dead children had become teenage fighters. The terrified family had become a terrorist cell. The tragic mistake had become a justified military action. The pressure to sign the false report was relentless and came from multiple directions. Major Phillips, a staff officer with aspiration for higher command, employed a mixture of threats and appeals to unit loyalty. Captain Morrison, the intelligence officer who had provided the flawed targeting information, alternated between intimidation and promises of career advancement. "Think about your future, Sergeant," Phillips said during one particularly intense session. "You've got a good record, commendations for bravery, the respect of your men. Don't throw that away over a bureaucratic technicality." But Nolan couldn't forget the faces of those children, couldn't erase the sound of their grandmother's wailing, couldn't rationalize away the truth he had witnessed. Every night, he saw them in his dreams. Every morning, he woke up knowing that signing that report would betray their memory and make their deaths meaningless. "I won't sign it," he said finally, his voice quiet but unwavering. What happened in that compound wasn't a military victory. It was a tragedy, and pretending otherwise won't bring those people back to life. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Within hours, Nolan found himself transferred to a different unit, his security clearance suspended, his access to classified materials revoked. The investigation that followed was less about uncovering truth than about building a case for his removal. Evidence appeared that Nolan had never seen before: classified documents, supposedly found in his quarters, communications with journalists that had never occurred, witness statements from soldiers who claimed he had expressed anti-military sentiments. The fabrication was sophisticated and thorough, designed by people who understood how to manipulate the military justice system. Captain Sarah Chen, a young military defense attorney, was assigned to represent Nolan during his court-martial. She was idealistic, dedicated, and completely unprepared for the level of corruption she was about to encounter. Her attempts to challenge evidence were blocked by classification rules. Her requests for discovery were denied on national security grounds. Her witnesses were transferred to other bases or deployed overseas before they could testify. "This isn't justice," she told Nolan during one of their preparation meetings. "This is a railroad job, and I don't know how to stop it." The trial itself was a masterclass in legal theater. The prosecution presented their manufactured evidence with polished professionalism, painting Nolan as a disgruntled soldier whose combat stress had turned him against his own country. Character witnesses who might have supported him were conveniently unavailable. Documentary evidence that might have contradicted the official narrative was classified beyond Chen's reach. The verdict was predetermined, but hearing it pronounced still felt like a physical blow. Guilty on all charges, 25 years in prison, reduction to the rank of private, dishonorable discharge, loss of all benefits and military honors. Nolan stood at attention as his military career was systematically destroyed by lies and political expediency. Briggs had been present during the sentencing, still recovering from his own wounds but determined to support the man who had saved his life. As military police approached to take Nolan into custody, their eyes met across the courtroom. In that moment, Briggs made a silent promise that would consume the next 2 years of his life. The transfer to Belmarsh prison was justified as a security measure. Officially, Nolan was being placed there for his own protection, surrounded by terrorists and murderers. He would be safer than in a standard military prison where other soldiers might sympathize with his situation. Unofficially, he was being buried as deeply as the British penal system would allow. The maximum security wing of Belmarsh was designed to hold men who would never taste freedom again. Solitary confinement became Nolan's universe, a concrete cell measuring 8 feet by 10 feet, with a narrow window that provided a view of nothing but gray sky and razor wire. Years passed in a haze of routine and desperation. Breakfast slid through a slot in the door. 1 hour of exercise in a concrete courtyard. Books from a limited prison library. Nolan studied law, history, philosophy, anything that could keep his mind sharp and his hope alive. But hope was dangerous. In a place like Belmarsh, hope could drive a man insane when it was repeatedly crushed by the indifferent machinery of incarceration. Meanwhile, Briggs had been assigned to the Queen's Guard, a posting that should have been the highlight of his military career. Standing watch at Buckingham Palace, participating in state ceremonies, serving as a living symbol of British military tradition. But the pomp and pageantry felt hollow when he knew that an innocent man was rotting in prison for refusing to lie. The research began during his off-duty hours. Military libraries, government archives, legal databases. Briggs immersed himself in the labyrinthine world of military law and historical precedent. His red uniform opened doors that would have remained closed to civilians. His military bearing commanded respect from archivists and librarians, who might otherwise have been suspicious of unusual requests. The breakthrough came in the basement archives of the Ministry of Defense, where forgotten documents mouldered in filing cabinets that hadn't been opened in decades. Buried among thousands of routine administrative papers, Briggs discovered something extraordinary: the Military Personnel Repatriation Act of 1892. The law had been written in response to a Victorian-era scandal involving British soldiers who had been wrongfully imprisoned in colonial territories. It provided an emergency mechanism for the rapid return and rehabilitation of military personnel who had been unjustly detained, bypassing normal appeals processes and requiring only credible evidence of procedural irregularities. The language was archaic, the legal precedents were ancient, but the statute was still technically in force. More importantly, it offered a pathway around the bureaucratic obstacles that had blocked every previous attempt to challenge Nolan's conviction. But Briggs needed more than legal theory. He needed evidence, real, tangible proof that Nolan had been framed, that the charges against him were fabricated, that the entire prosecution was a conspiracy to silence a whistleblower. Captain Sarah Chen had left military service shortly after Nolan's trial, the experience having shattered her faith in military justice. She now practiced family law in Manchester, trying to help people navigate custody disputes and divorce proceedings, rather than fighting impossible battles against institutional corruption. When Briggs appeared at her office, still wearing his Queen's Guard uniform, she initially refused to see him. "I did everything I could for Sergeant Nolan," she told her secretary. "The system destroyed him. and there's nothing anyone can do about it now. But Briggs was persistent. He waited in her reception area for 3 consecutive days, politely declining to leave until she would grant him a brief conversation. Finally, professional curiosity overcame her reluctance to revisit painful memories. "What could you possibly tell me that would make any difference?" Chen demanded as Briggs sat across from her desk. "I fought that case with everything I had. The evidence was manufactured. The witnesses were coached. The judge was biased. It was a complete travesty, but it was legally unassailable." Briggs spread his research across her desk: photocopies of the 1892 law, analysis of legal precedents, a detailed breakdown of how the historical statute could be applied to modern circumstances. Chen's expression shifted from skepticism to amazement as she absorbed the implications. "This is brilliant," she whispered, studying the documents with renewed hope. "But we still need proof of prosecutorial misconduct. Without evidence of the frame-up, this law won't help us." The evidence came from an unexpected source: Major Phillips. One of the officers who had pressured Nolan to sign the false report had died suddenly of a heart attack 6 months earlier. His widow, Margaret Phillips, was a military spouse who had spent 30 years watching her husband's career advance through careful political calculation and moral compromise. While cleaning out her deceased husband's personal effects, Mrs. Phillips discovered a sealed envelope hidden in the back of his desk drawer. The envelope was marked insurance policy in her husband's handwriting, and its contents made her blood run cold. Inside were photocopies of the original Operation Sandstorm reports, the real versions, not the sanitized documents that had been submitted to higher command, witness statements describing civilian casualties, photographs of the crime scene showing children's bodies, intelligence assessments admitting that the targeting information had been flawed. Her husband had kept proof of his own corruption, perhaps as leverage against his superiors, perhaps as protection against future scapegoating. The documents revealed the systematic nature of the cover-up, showing how witness statements had been altered, evidence had been suppressed, and an innocent soldier had been sacrificed to protect the careers of his superiors. Getting those documents required delicate negotiation. Mrs. Phillips was terrified of retaliation, worried about her military pension, concerned about the safety of her family. But she was also a mother, and the thought of an innocent man suffering in prison while his persecutors prospered was more than her conscience could bear. "My husband was many things," she told Briggs during their clandestine meeting in a Manchester coffee shop. "But toward the end, I think he regretted what he had done. Maybe this is his way of making amends." With the Phillips documents in hand, Briggs needed one final piece of his puzzle: a sitting judge with military jurisdiction who could validate his legal strategy and sign the repatriation order. That brought him to Sir Edmund Blackwood, a retired jurist whose 6-decade career had encompassed every aspect of British military law. At 87, Sir Edmund was still sharp as a blade, living in comfortable retirement at his Gloucestershire estate. When Briggs appeared at his door with his research and evidence, the old judge listened with growing fascination and outrage. "What you're describing isn't just a miscarriage of justice," Sir Edmund said after reviewing the materials. "It's a systematic perversion of military law designed to protect careers at the expense of truth. If these documents are authentic, then we have both the legal mechanism and the evidence necessary to secure Sergeant Nolan's immediate release." The legal document they prepared was a masterpiece of jurisprudential precision. Every clause was researched, every precedent cited, every possible challenge anticipated. The Military Personnel Repatriation Act of 1892 was invoked in its entirety, supported by 17 pages of legal argument and documentary evidence. Sir Edmund's signature on the repatriation order was firm despite his advanced age. "This is either the most important document I've signed in 50 years on the bench," he told Briggs, "or it's going to destroy both our reputations in spectacular fashion." The document demanded Nolan's immediate release pending a full investigation of his conviction. It didn't require proof of innocence, merely credible evidence of procedural irregularities or prosecutorial misconduct. The Phillips papers provided that evidence in overwhelming detail, but having the legal authority was only half the battle. Briggs still had to enter Belmarsh prison, navigate its bureaucratic maze, and secure Nolan's physical release before powerful enemies could intervene to block the order. The walk through Belmarsh's corridors was like descending through circles of hell. Each security checkpoint represented another potential failure point, another opportunity for the system to assert its power and deny justice. Briggs' escort was a veteran guard named Williams, who had spent 3 decades witnessing every form of human degradation the prison system could produce. Never seen anything like this, Williams admitted as they passed through the 4th security door. Queen's Guard showing up with century-old legal papers, demanding to see a prisoner who's been in isolation for 7 years. What's your story, soldier? Briggs chose his words carefully. The man you're holding saved my life in Afghanistan. I've spent 2 years proving he was innocent. Williams stopped walking and studied Briggs with new understanding. Military brotherhood, eh? Heard stories about that kind of loyalty. Never witnessed it firsthand. Your mate must be something special to inspire this kind of dedication. The maximum security wing housed the worst criminals in the British system, terrorists who had tried to destroy London, spies who had betrayed state secrets, murderers who showed no remorse for their crimes. The fact that Nolan had survived 7 years in this environment without breaking testified to an inner strength that few men possessed. Cell 347 sat at the end of a corridor, designed to isolate its occupant from human contact. The guard stationed outside looked up in amazement as Briggs approached. Visitors to this section required weeks of advanced security clearance and approval from multiple government agencies. The key turned in the lock with a sound like thunder in the oppressive silence. When the cell door swung open, it revealed a man who had been broken down and rebuilt so many times that he seemed to exist beyond normal categories of human suffering. Reese Nolan had aged 20 years and 7, his hair gone completely white, his face carved with deep lines of endurance and pain, but his eyes still burned with the same fire that had carried a wounded brother across an Afghan battlefield. When recognition dawned, when he realized that Briggs was standing in his cell doorway like an apparition from another life, that inner flame blazed even brighter. Callum? Nolan's voice was hoarse from years of minimal conversation, uncertain and fragile with hope. Tell me this is real. Tell me I haven't finally lost my sanity. Briggs stepped into the cell and extended the release order, his hand steady despite the emotional magnitude of the moment. You saved my life in Helmand Province, mate. Took me longer than I wanted, but I'm here to settle the debt. The walk back through the prison corridors was surreal. Word spread through the maximum security wing like wildfire. Someone was walking out. Someone had beaten the system that was designed to be unbeatable. Other prisoners pressed against their cell doors, shouting encouragement, creating disturbances that required additional guards to maintain order. Bloody miracle, Williams muttered as they navigated the chaos. 30 years I've worked this job. Never seen anything like it. It's like watching Moses lead the Israelites out of Egypt. But outside the prison walls, phones were ringing in government offices as news of Nolan's release triggered emergency responses. Throughout the military hierarchy, the men who had orchestrated his downfall 7 years earlier were still in positions of power, their careers built on foundations of buried scandals and systematic corruption. Colonel Harrison, now Assistant Director of Military Personnel, received the notification while reviewing promotion recommendations. The voice on the secure line was professionally calm, but carried undertones of barely controlled panic. Sir, we have a critical situation at Belmarsh. Someone has secured the release of prisoner 4471 using some kind of historical legal mechanism. Harrison felt his blood pressure spike. He hadn't thought about that prisoner number in years, but he remembered it like his own service number. That's impossible. All appeals were exhausted. Who authorized this action? That's the problem. Sir, it wasn't an appeal. It's some kind of emergency repatriation order signed by a reserve military magistrate. Our legal department says it appears to be legitimate, but the precedent dates back over a century. By the time Harrison's frantic calls reached Belmarsh Prison, it was too late for any intervention. Briggs and Nolan were already walking through the main gates into the gray November afternoon. For Nolan, stepping onto public pavement felt like emerging from a tomb, the first taste of freedom in 7 years. The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. Someone had alerted the press, perhaps Williams, impressed by the display of military loyalty, or possibly Sir Edmund's clerk, who understood the historical significance of what was unfolding. Reporters surrounded them like sharks sensing blood in the water. Questions came in rapid-fire succession. How does it feel to be free? Were you really innocent? Who was responsible for your wrongful imprisonment? What are your plans now? Will you seek compensation? Nolan, overwhelmed by the noise and crowd after years of enforced solitude, looked to Briggs for guidance. The Queen's Guard stepped forward with practiced authority, his ceremonial uniform commanding respect even from aggressive journalists. Sergeant Nolan will make a statement when he's ready, Briggs announced to the assembled media. Right now, he needs time to process his freedom and reconnect with his family. The parliamentary inquiry that followed was swift and merciless. The Phillips documents, combined with renewed media scrutiny, forced investigations that could not be ignored or buried. Colonel Harrison found himself the subject of criminal charges within weeks. His career imploding as evidence of his role in the cover-up became undeniable. Captain Sarah Chen returned to military law with renewed purpose, leading a team of advocates dedicated to reviewing cases of potentially wrongful military convictions. The systematic abuse that had destroyed Nolan's life became the catalyst for comprehensive reforms in military justice procedures, but the real victory was quieter and more personal. Nolan spent his first weeks of freedom at Briggs' London apartment, slowly readjusting to a world that had changed dramatically during his incarceration. Technology had advanced, social media had transformed communication, streaming services had revolutionized entertainment, simple things that free people took for granted. 6 months after his release, both men stood before the Afghanistan War Memorial, wearing their dress uniforms for a ceremony honoring fallen comrades. The parliamentary inquiry had officially cleared Nolan's name, restored his rank and benefits, and awarded substantial compensation for his wrongful imprisonment. More importantly, new safeguards had been established to prevent similar abuses in the future. Was it worth it? Briggs asked quietly, thinking about the cost, the lost years, the psychological trauma, the battles that would never completely heal. Nolan traced the carved names of dead soldiers with reverent fingers every night in that cell. I remembered those children's faces. I remembered their father trying to shield them from bullets. If I had signed that false report, if I had helped cover up their deaths, they would have died for nothing. At least this way, someone knows their story. As evening shadows lengthened across the Memorial Plaza, 2 soldiers stood in contemplative silence. They were bound by combat, tested by injustice, and united in the knowledge that some principles transcend personal cost. The system had tried to break one and ignore the other, but loyalty and truth had ultimately prevailed. Their brotherhood, forged in Afghan fire and tempered in British prisons, had proven unbreakable.